Well, the main finding is that discretionary remote working, so allowing your employees to choose which days to work remotely or not at their discretion, has a meaningful and significant effect on the work-family conflict experienced by mothers and the job performance experienced by everyone, especially mothers. It's a positive effect, without any kind of any real negative effects. It was a life sciences company in Cambridge, England, that allowed me to come in and perform some research, and people were randomly assigned to different weeks of either working remotely at their discretion or the kind of business as usual approach, which generally involved coming to the office every day. And we found that overall, in the remote working weeks, people tended to be much happier in the sense of having significantly reduced work-family conflict, and also tended to improve self-reported job performance. Although this effect was primarily driven by the experiences of working mothers and was either positive or neutral for other employee subgroups. I think one of the primary implications is this shows how an informal policy that is gender neutral in its uptake. So one of the key findings is that men and women worked remotely an equivalent number of days during the weeks they were allowed to do so. So policies that have equivalent gender uptake have the effect of normalizing the behavior. So if you think about formal flexibility policies, those tend to be used almost exclusively by women. That's working reduced number of hours, or perhaps job share or compressed work weeks, whereas this is something in discretionary remote working that seemed to be equally appealing to both men and women. I think that really is important because there's some evidence from this study at least that you can avoid the negative and stigmatizing effects of some of the formal flexibility policies, and instead really have the outcome of normalizing this kind of behavior insofar as both men and women do it. It's a great question. It's really often very difficult to ascertain the mechanism in this kind of field trial, but from some interviews I did, it seemed like one of the primary drivers focused around the commute. So people essentially tend to live close to where their kids go to school and far away from where they work, relatively speaking. And so on the days when women and mothers in particular could work remotely, that allowed them to sort of do the school run, sort the kids out in a much quicker fashion, much more straightforward, less stressful fashion, and that seemed to be very important. I mean, there were some people who did work from home as much as possible. They tended to be the outliers, and in fact, the interviews I conducted suggested that most people, the vast majority, were actually very apprehensive about working remotely for more than 2 or maybe 3 days a week. They would explicitly and without being prompted say, you know what, 4 days, 5 days, it's not what I want. I would feel very disconnected and socially isolated. Well, I would say that a lot of firms are very apprehensive about this kind of policy. There's a general concern, particularly among managers, that if I let people work remotely even a little bit, the work product will suffer. I would say it's certainly not for all roles. I completely accept there are some roles where it's just not feasible to have people working remotely at all, but I would say that's probably the minority. I think for most white-collar knowledge work kind of jobs, I think it's probably much more feasible than people imagine, and the resistance is primarily cultural. It's just something that seems counter-normative. To which I would say, if you're really concerned that your employees are going to start watching hours and hours of television the second you aren't looking over their shoulder, then you probably shouldn't have hired them in the first place. Whereas if you trust your recruiting and onboarding, then you should be pretty comfortable with the idea that you can treat your employees like adults and they're going to respond accordingly.